Who Sent You was brought to you by Century 21 Rehabilitation Services Incorporated, California nonprofit 501c3 509A1, for charitable and educational purposes. To understand how an entire history is erased, you have to look past the modern textbooks and examine the physical artifacts left behind on the city streets, in the archives, and in the elite parlors of the ruling class. This is a chronological investigation into a systematic, calculated visual shell game, a centuries-long campaign designed to paint over the vibrant reality and replace it with a pale, convenient myth. This is the art of deception. The timeline begins long before the English colonies of Virginia, pushing the clock back to literal points of contact. The supposed earliest recorded European encounter with the original people of North America is said to be the Vikings. Around the year 1000, Thorvald Eriksson sailed to the mainland of North America, a region that they named Vinland. According to the ancient Greenlander's saga, when the Norsemen encountered the indigenous inhabitants, they did not see the pale, feathered caricatures of modern folklore. They described a robust, fiercely sovereign people, whom they called Skraelings. In the Old Norse language, the description centered on a deeply dark, swarthy complexion and intense, wide facial features. The Vikings recorded them as a powerful, formidable force, so formidable that after a series of bloody skirmishes, the Norsemen abandoned their settlements entirely. Nearly 500 years later, in October 1492, Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas, writing a literal corporate audit to his financial backers, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Columbus described the Taino people as very well made, with very handsome bodies, short, coarse hair, and possessing the exact color of the Canaries, neither black nor white. Now, to his 15th century audience, this meant that the native population possessed the intensely dark, deeply bronzed, swarthy, copper-brown skin tones of the indigenous Canary Islanders. Columbus explicitly noted that the complexion of the people was a deep, dark, copper brown.
Black like Ethiopians, early accounts of the Carolina Indians. In 1524, Giovanni da Verrazzano, an Italian explorer sailing under the French flag, documented his first encounter with the indigenous inhabitants of the Carolinas. In a letter to King Francis I, he vividly described the people he encountered as having a complexion black like Ethiopians, with strong features and a distinctive way of life. This remarkable account provides an early glimpse into the diversity of indigenous cultures in the Americas, challenging conventional narratives about the region's original inhabitants. Verrazzano's observations not only highlight their physical characteristics, but also their advanced societal organization, resourceful lifestyles, and the rich, untapped potential of the land itself.
By the early 1600s, this written truth became a three-dimensional reality in London. Tobacco shops began displaying carved wooden figures to advertise the bounty of the New World, calling them Virgin men, Virginia men. the early English ship carvers who fashioned these icons, reading the direct logs of the Virginia Company and the explorers who encountered the Powhatan and Algonquin people, used their tools with an intent for accuracy. They carved the figures with their true physical characteristics: deeply melanated, rich, dark, copper-toned skin, accompanied by strong, wide facial structures, full lips, and broad noses. These features were a direct visual translation of the original historical records. As European empires expanded their global trade networks, the honest image of the dark copper American began to morph into a tool for imperial propaganda and elite decoration. History tells us that on March 5th, 1770, a man named Crispus Attucks became the first American to bleed for liberty. Open any textbook today, and you will see him framed through a very narrow lens. You will see illustrations of an unambiguous, so-called black man leading a crowd against British tyranny. But modern history loves a lazy shortcut.
Boston, 1770. A mob, angered by rising taxation imposed from London, confronts British troops. As tensions rise, the first shots of the American Revolution are fired. The first to die is Crispus Attucks. His name will go down in history, but who was this man, and why did he put himself in the line of fire?
We are taught to look at a complex human being and reduce him to a single continent. If all white people don't come from England, and all Asian people don't come from China, then why assume that every dark-skinned, melanated soul on Earth must have come from Africa? It's a ridiculous oversimplification, and in early America, it was likely a deliberate weapon. Long before European ships ever docked on these shores, the Wampanoag people held this land. It was theirs by birthright, by history, and by sovereign law. Crispus Attucks carries a name widely considered to be Wampanoag. He likely belonged to the people who were here first. In 1524, when explorer and spy Giovanni da Verrazzano sailed down this very coast, he didn't see Hollywood Indians. He wrote that they were dark in color, not unlike the Ethiopians. Think about that. If the original caretakers of this soil already possessed a deep, rich, dark complexion, how can any modern historian look at a colonial registry and automatically assume that dark skin means a foreign import? You can't. But the colonizers knew exactly what they were doing. They used that visual overlap to execute what was a quieter kind of slaughter, a paper genocide. Under colonial law, if a person was recognized as an Indian, they had a legal claim to their ancestral homelands. So tax assessors, census takers, and slaveholders systematically stopped writing the word Indian. Instead, they forced the original inhabitants into broad, arbitrary legal buckets, like Negro, mulatto, or musty. By rewriting a man's geographic origin on a government ledger, they legally severed him from his birthright. If a town clerk could look at a registry and declare that there were no more Indians left alive, then the tribal land titles were simply erased. The reservation lands were dissolved, and the property was stolen, all with the stroke of a pen. In the multiracial crucible of the early Atlantic trade, shaped by centuries of Moorish presence in Europe and fluid maritime networks, the physical reality of the American inhabitant was heavily dark-complected. But as the business of empire formalized and the United States began expanding westward in the 19th century, commercialism required a new narrative. The complex, dark realities recorded by early explorers were systematically scrubbed away. The noble savage myth was born. Industrial carvers manufactured a monolithic, romanticized, and heavily lightened image of the Native American, creating a corporate mascot that sanitized a brutal history of displacement. The art of deception lies not in forgetting history, but in replacing it with a more convenient fiction. At the turn of the century, the federal government began carving up millions of acres of communal Indian land into individual plots. To get a piece of this empire, your name had to be on a federal registry known as the Dawes Rolls. This massive transfer of wealth created an irresistible magnet for scandalous opportunists, thieves, and corrupt gatekeepers. People like Napoleon Bonaparte Moore. Napoleon was an attorney who turned identity theft into a commercial enterprise. For $5 under the table, he provided white settlers with a back door into stolen land. He fabricated family trees, forged legal testimonies, and paid off officials to stamp lies with government ink. He created an army of ghosts. Hundreds of wealthy white opportunists were transformed overnight into what history calls $5 Indians. Legally inheriting wealth meant strictly for indigenous families. Now, one would think that a deception this massive would end up in handcuffs, but of course it didn't. Napoleon Bonaparte Moore never spent a single day in prison. He weaponized a legal system that was already indifferent to indigenous survival, ensuring his crimes were treated not as fraud, but as legal consulting. Congress ultimately chose to ratify the corrupted rolls rather than to fix them. Moore kept his freedom, his fortune, and his pristine reputation, proving that in the American West, the law didn't stop the crime. The law was the crime.
When a lot of the whites found out the benefits that these blacks were going to be entitled to, a lot of whites went to the Dawes Commission and say, look, why don't you put my name on there? They said, but you're not an Indian. So that's what they said, well, I'll give you $5. So then the rule got around, the policy got around that for $5, that a white could put his name on the Dawes rolls and be called himself an Indian and be entitled to all these benefits, and all their children could be entitled to all these benefits forever. And so that became known as what's called a $5 Indian.
We have to pause here because the $5 Indian wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something far more powerful: the government record. See, if an Indian could be persuaded or pressured to call himself something else, well, that was one thing. But what happens when the government decides to make that decision for you? Enter Walter Ashby Plecker, a physician and Virginia's first state registrar of vital statistics, a committed believer in eugenics, the pseudoscientific movement that claimed society could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce. and preserving what eugenicists called desirable racial traits. Plecker wasn't simply interested in documenting race. He was interested in controlling it. In 1924, Virginia passed the Racial Integrity Act. And this is where the story gets interesting. The law required that racial classifications be recorded by the state and prohibited marriage between white people and non-white people. But Plecker's standard for determining who was white was extraordinarily restrictive. A white person under the law was someone who had no trace whatsoever of blood other than Caucasian. Think about that. Think about what it means. The state wanted the final word. And here's where Virginia's Indians collided directly with Plecker's racial ideology. The law actually listed American Indian among the racial categories that could appear on the state's registration forms. But Plecker increasingly treated Virginia's Indians as something else.
In simplistic terms, every individual living in the Commonwealth of Virginia was required to state their race on a registration card that was issued by the Bureau of Vital Statistics. Also, the law stated that there were only two races in Virginia, quote, white or quote, colored. If a person failed to register, they could be charged with a felony and 1 year of confinement in the state penitentiary.
He claimed that there were no native-born Virginia Indians free from what he called Negro intermixture. In other words, if you were a Virginia Indian, Plecker was prepared to classify you as colored.
Once this legislation was enacted, Dr. Walter Plecker, the director and registrar of the Virginia Bureau of Vital Statistics, used the entire state apparatus to increase the tax on particular communities in Virginia, especially Indigenous Virginians. Due to this law, Indigenous Virginians were eliminated from written record because they were to be identified as colored instead of as Indian. The act was the beginning of a paper genocide in Virginia.
But then something very strange happened. There was one problem with Virginia's obsession with racial purity. Virginia's white elite had an Indian ancestor, or at least they claimed that they did. Pocahontas.
After the passage of the Racial Integrity Act, a supplemental law had to be enacted to address the issue of many prominent white families in Virginia being classified as colored because they descended from Pocahontas. Known as the Pocahontas exception, this law allowed prominent Virginia families that claimed to trace their ancestry through indigenous people or were descendants of Pocahontas and John Rolfe could still be classified as white.
For generations, prominent Virginia families had claimed descent from Pocahontas and her English husband, John Rolfe. And that created a rather inconvenient problem. If the Commonwealth suddenly declared that any amount of Indian ancestry made you non-white, some of Virginia's most prominent white families could suddenly find themselves on the wrong side of the racial line. And so the law contained an extraordinary exception. Under the 1924 law, a person could still be considered white if they had 1/16 or less American Indian ancestry, provided they had no other non-Caucasian ancestry. 1/16.
Actor Edward Norton found out that he has a very famous ancestor, Pocahontas.
Yes.
The Glass Onion and Fight Club star learned this on an episode of PBS's Finding Your Roots, where the host revealed the genealogy.
It turns out a paper trail shows that Pocahontas is Norton's 12th great-grandmother and married his grandfather, John Rolfe, on April 5th, 1614 in Jamestown, Virginia.
The state was supposedly protecting racial integrity, but Indian ancestry itself wasn't necessarily the problem. The problem was who was claiming it. For an elite white Virginian, a small amount of Indian ancestry could be compatible with whiteness. For Virginia's actual Indian communities, Plecker insisted that Indian identity was frequently evidence of something else. And this is where the story becomes paper genocide. Because you don't have to physically remove a people to attack their identity. You can erase them from the paperwork. And eventually, the paper says they were never what they said they were. Ultimately, the question becomes, what happened to the people whose records Walter Plecker changed?